Now, I'd like to invite Franz Vollenweider on stage. This idea of Franz speaking in the last space of the conference actually came from our discussions in the last 2 years, also on the conference, last conference, when he was beginning to talk about his progression from a neurobiological researcher, also becoming more interested in psychotherapeutic processes again. So I'm very much looking forward to your talk, Franz.
Thank you very much, Henrik. Do we go back? Oh, shit. Where can I go back? Can I go up to the first slide? Okay, next slide. Okay, welcome you. It's a pleasure to speak here every 2 years. For those who do not know, I originally was trained in biochemistry and then went into psychoanalysis in Zurich because the high time with psychoanalytical centers in Zurich, the Freudian and Neo-Freudian. I was for the Neo-Freudian and more Kohut-like understanding of self-objects and all these things. Then I went back
Franz,
to
can you try to bring the microphone a little bit up?
So, like this? Yes. Okay, anyway, I was in the beginning very interested in the psychodynamics of the psyche. And on the other hand, going back to medicine from the more biochemical consideration, I did research in that field in brain slices. I became very interested in the pharmacology of psychedelics, and I wanted to bring these two things together. I thought I'd do a few studies into the brain, and then we go back to the clinic, as we did in Zurich for years. We treated patients with psilocybin LSD, particularly a little bit with MDMA, but not on a daily basis. So anyway, when I started, we had no idea about how these drugs really work and what receptors are important. We have known that the 2A receptor may be the receptor based on a number of animal studies. So what we did at that time in '98 was blocking this receptor. Is there a light here? No. A pointer?
The meter?
Huh? No. Okay, thank you. Yes, the 2A receptor is the most important. So we blocked this receptor, and effectively we couldn't see any psychological symptoms in volunteers. But we blocked also a number of others, like the 1A, we activated the 1A, we played with the 2 antagonists, this D1, we had a partial agonist that we tried to combine with psychedelics. Anyway, what was then found is that if we activate the 2A receptors with the release of glutamate, with activates a number of other different systems, like the glutamate system. And two systems are very important. One is the AMPA receptor system. It doesn't work really. And this activates BDNF and enhances neuroplasticity. That is what is discussed at the moment, that a downstream effect may be even more important than the 2A mechanism. The other thing is activating of NMDA receptors. This activates learning, and in fact in animals we have evidence that psychedelics like psilocybin change associative learning through NMDA receptor activation, and that AMPA agonists per se enhance a kind of depression in animal models. So that is an open space independent of the psychedelic space, but these two spaces meet here, and this, you can imagine, this independent mechanism has been a lot of giving a lot of rumors in pharmaceutical companies that is jumping up on this now, looking for psychedelics that may not be really psychedelics. Anyway, what I was interested in is in the idea that psychedelics alter the sense of self. You can read that everywhere, and I wrote here down, it alters the self-ego matrix that's often described as losing of ego boundaries, changing the self-environmental boundaries, so that a lot of approaches have been done to catch that phenomena and alter the sense of self. But this is a whole story. I could talk an hour about that, how people approach that. In fact, in the end, what we have are rating scales, and we have to think, how can we better catch up these phenomena that the self and the boundaries of the self are changed or losing it in this state, or that, as people say, we are more connected, or we are oneness. It's a nice word, but every subject we have investigated, believe me, more than 1,000 in Zurich, they have other ideas about what is oneness, what is unity, what is, I don't know, what is the self, what is an ego dissolution. So we need much better instruments to go into that questions. And why is that so important for me? It's important because on the one hand, people like to have objective data about as a correlates of self-experience, and that's what we're looking for. And we hope to learn through neuroscience to improve access to the psyche, and even if we understand the mechanism, that we can improve the therapy. But if we want to improve the therapy, we have to understand the psyche first. So the other thing is, what is an old thing, it's nothing new. Always in the 70s, Leuner in Germany particularly has pointed out that emotion regulation is one of the key functions in psychedelic states that leads to alterations on the long run. The other thing is, what is discussed now through pharmaceutical companies driven, do we need the conscious experience of the psychedelic experience? Or is the unconscious experience way enough? These are questions I'm interested in at the moment, and I will show you a few little ideas about what we do to approach these questions. So, Leuner in Germany said it's a regression of the self. Okay, that's a psychoanalytical term, regression of self functions. But who knows nowadays what are self functions? Most what people say, it lowers defense. That's one function among many different functions relatively clearly defined in psychoanalytical thinking. People say, people go back to primary processing. That means being less rational, seeing things more animistic and all these things. What people often say is reduce cognitive control, lowering defense and descending, but who has ever measured that in a psychedelic state? I'm not aware of any study looking at these nice terms, nice concepts, but we don't know in the end. What Leuner then said, activation of the emotions comes first as a lowering of ego boundaries, the function, less defense, and then activation of emotions. But what we see in brain research is that the psychedelics per se activate emotions, very basic emotions, without being dependent on the ego dissolution. That's what comes first. So it's interesting, and certainly Leuner said integration of these things. What is different in that studies, Leuner did, and he did excellent studies from my understanding with large sample sizes, more than 100 people. He used multiple doses, moderate doses, 15 to 20 milligrams of psilocybin. But one doses helped sometimes, but often it had to be repeated. That's a marked difference what people think today. Now, here, just for people that are not so in psychodynamics, what we think about the ego from a psychodynamic point use, it is a structure. It's not a thing, it's not an entirety, it's nothing in the brain, a fixed network. It's a very dynamic thing, and it has functions. Functions as defense, inhibiting Freud, mediation, mastering the tension, reality testing. But the most important, I think, is what we hardly understand is the synthetic function, an organ of equilibrium, and coordinating on making cohesion among experiences. Stick them together. That goes from inner experience to the outer experience, interoceptive experience, like I look into my body feelings, and I look at the environment. This is a continuous making cohesion, what the brain may do. So this is a psychoanalytic concept. On the other side, you have representation. Also, the ego matrix or the ego self matrix is a function that can, to a certain extent, represent itself, self-representation. That's, when I say, that's my body. I'm walking now. These are my emotions. These are my thoughts. Or if you're going to go up there, you can say, it's on an abstract level, my thoughts is my belief system. So, but in the way we label that domain thoughts. So self-representation is very important because you have to find a mechanism in the brain that you are in the flow of consciousness, and now a mechanism has to represent itself, so some recursive looping about what's going on. That is self-representation. That's what we know about us. That's the ego. And the ego has a certain, is affected by unconscious mechanism, which we say defense, inhibiting, mediation. So, but what we measure is on the right side, is the representation, or even multiple object representations, and that means that we stick on objects we have experienced earlier in our life, like the mother. Many people say the mother breast unity is what is an oceanic boundless experience that has to mature over a lifetime. So what the Buddhists say, and that's also interesting, they fight, they say, we try to keep an idle ego, like the psychoanalysis, and we always run after the idle ego. The idle ego is life, we are permanent, we are complete, immortal, and we are independent. The independent I under its own power, we call that, that's from Buddhistic terminology. And the breakthrough is modify that ego structure. That's work, it's the hard work. If you can do it with one trip, wow, I would like to do that, but I'm not on that level yet. But anyway, it's important that you see we can measure the representation of the ego, hardly the functions, and mostly it comes out in a very, very perfect way. I think we have no glasses here. So. Anyway, let's go to the next. How can we measure this? We have developed in Zurich over years rating scales to look at, thank you so much, to look at this ego dissolution from different angles and particularly measuring them. You can induce that through many other techniques. You don't have to take psychedelics. You can do sensory deprivation, relaxation techniques. Anyway, what we have to go on is that I'm so sorry, how does it work? Oceanic boundlessness is one pole of this ego dissolution. It's, you would say, it's a kind of, or similar, thank you so much, like a mystical-like states. And we have subscales. This is mathematically extracted over many, many iterations of data we had over years to improve. This is the Dietrich scale, this scale. But you see, this oceanic boundlessness has subscores like unity, feeling one, heightened mood and bliss and ecstasy, all the time space, disembodiment, insight, etc. So we can psychometrically assess what people say, and we can graduate that. We can relatively well measured. And I'm always surprised if you do dose-dependent study, how things go often linear, things become stronger and stronger and stronger with the dose. But on the other hand, we have this anxious evolution, which is more people try to protect them to fear. They lose control over their body and their thinking system. That's a threat to the ego. And they have thought disturbances, sometimes anxiety. This is driven mostly by the dose, with a number of studies to predict the difference, but it's still work in progress. We have ideas who protects what and how are things linked together. So here, just to say, and it's important for me, oceanic boundlessness is a positive ego dissolution, experience of unity, insightfulness, loss of ego boundaries, spiritual experience, deeply felt positive mood, disembodiment. That we can rate. It's very similar to the total score of the mystical scales that catch that. And they have also subscores, but people mostly publish this, the total score. And these two things, they correlate quite nicely. So, because they're derived from the same construction. So anyway, what we see that with oceanic boundlessness, we find the serotonin 2A receptors, we expect that occupied in frontal areas, in temporal areas, in the insula. And the more people are in that wonderful state of oceanic boundlessness, the more these brain regions are occupied by psilocybin. That fits the theory, but it brings the frontal cortex here and other cortex, about the cingulate cortex and the posterior cingulate, into attention of the whole research. Frontal regions in the brain are most important for more complex mechanism and have been told to be linked to the self. Now, in a further step, for instance, Catherine looked at LSD and psilocybin. They make very similar, if you look at that map, global alterations in resting state activity. Even they are very different in chemistry. And this network alterations, she has looked at the changes in connectivity, how the regions interact with each other. That's a measure, functional connectivity. And you see with the dose, the functional connectivity goes up in some brain regions between others. That's the red and yellow. They are differently coupled. And in some regions, it goes down. So that's a nice mapping of what's going on in the brain. This correlates, this changes with the occupancy of the 2A receptor or the density of the 2A receptor in the brain. And she was one who could show that in motor and sensory motor network disintegration, that this nicely goes with the disembodiment, but this is still measured subjectively. Now, people went on and said the default network is very important in self, and the frontomedial cortex and anticingulate here are very important for self-reference without content. The system can map itself, but this is not linked. I see a tree, I see this and that. You need other regions together with the default mode network, cortical regions, that add the content. And that's a very interesting observation based on many, many data. There is a system that's called the self that can map. The more something relates to you, the more it's activated. And what's important with the activation of that areas, they're always also very basis emotional areas activated. That means something that is self-relevant for you gets attached with emotions and meaning very early in the experience of the world or ourselves. If the objects, we are the objects, think about us. And you see that very basic primary processing in very basic areas of the brain that are important for the body experience get activated, and higher order, can you go back please, 2 slides? Jumped, one more. Here, that's important. Very basic information comes in, or it's the body information, it goes up a level. On a secondary level, emotions are attached, very basic, fear, anger, lust, care, panic, grief. It's not the higher cognitive categorization of the world. And then it goes up a level more to the cortex. It comes up from deeply brainstem regions to the limbic attachment of emotions, going up to the cortical integration and labeling what do I really experience. And this level projects back and organize the flow, and that may be something that that is related to psychodynamic thinking, that top-down cognitive system regulate emotional system regulates sensory system. So that's an interwoven cascade we try to start to understand. How can we do that? I show you here one experiment based on so-called predictive coding. That means that if we stimulate the brain, or in this case, an arm with different intensity, give them stimuli, people realize that, and we change the intensity or the number of stimuli. So this is a jump, and this is not expected. If you are on this level, you think, the next may be the same stimulus. No, it jumps, and this is what can produce a so-called prediction error. Then it goes on with that, sometimes 2, 3, up to 12, and it jumps down, it goes up, it jumps down. So we're gonna detect that as a very basic sensory information of the body. And for this, we use frontal cortical areas, we need the thalamic areas, temporal areas, and the insula. That's how we build up an inner experience of our body based on somatosensory processing. And you need this jumping, so the brain is always making a model. What will be next? And always, if the model does not fit, that's interesting, that's a surprise, it amplifies the response. Now, what we had is a really strong effect on disembodiment in this study. And then we have looked how does this disembodiment relate to something we measure physiologically that represents the self in a physiological sense. And what you see that psychedelics, in this case psilocybin, reduces the activity in frontal areas and visual areas, but also a little bit in the thalamus. It was not so significant in this study, but fits the theory that the frontal cortex is really important for the self. So this is a method how we could access the self without asking people. If we have more and more data, we can say, okay, if we have this pattern, that's big hope, we need much more data, we can trace out they have really an altered body sense. Then if we did simultaneously EEG recordings, and here it was the very same, we do it together, the fMRI and EEG, the EEG is much faster, and what we saw there within these regions, when they are less activated, that it really nicely correlates, even there are only about 16 to 20 subjects, with disembodiment and the feeling of unity. So frontal cortex is not just a detector or processor of the self or an aspect of the self like the body self, which is very important, but it's also cognitively controlled top-down and is linked to the inner experience of unity or disembodiment. These things go together. So we can do it in other ways. We can do it acoustically. I don't want to run into that too much. We did a similar experiment where people had to speak, make sound, and we shifted the sound a little bit, or a little bit up or down, or we changed it with another person's sound, or with a female or male. And that's also, the brain expects his own voice, but when we change that and sneak that in, people get surprised. And this exactly gave same activation in frontal areas, temporal areas that are altered with psychedelics and go again with feelings of unity and change meaning of percept. So everything points to these frontal areas. This is a very fast method, very cheap. We can do that before we go with the patient on the trip, maybe a week before, and after 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 6 months. So we have a really fantastic labeling how he deals with himself and his self-function. How can he deal with that? So that's where the first two approach now. Nobody has done it so far. So, but we'll see whether we're going to use that. The other thing is what we learned from the meditation people about emotion regulation is we measured in them every day during the retreat and we did other retreats now. How do they regulate the emotion? What strategy they had? They had reappraisal, decentering, and suppression. And the other thing was we had ratings for acceptance, and that remembered me of Henrik's paper where you can. How can you let people go, and how is acceptance related to emotion regulation? So we had a lot of data from these studies where people were meditating, and what they do is they let things go, this decentering or this acceptance, and try. This was very interesting with the experts. They said they have no fear. They have the most wild experience on the psychedelics. They never came up with fear. We never saw that. Very tiny. If you do the same with normal people, not meditators, they have 20% of fear. Let's say they have 1 or 2. The same dose have higher dose. But when we do it with beginners, with meditation beginners, they also had much more fear than the experts. And that was an interesting comparison. What is the emotion regulation doing in beginners versus experts? They must be different, how they deal with emotions. And what is the benefit of this experience, of this strong experience that we rated 4 months later, 6 months later. So what was interesting here was that anyway, the experts had very strong experiences, let's say blissful, people on placebo, quite less, unity, quite strong. People would have the same dose in a lab situation or in a retreat, beginners, as about 50 to 60. Also the people that are experts are better, so there must be a difference. And what we found is, just show that, we focused on self-acceptance after 4 months, placebo, here psilocybin. It was the frontal cortex involved. The more people could accept, the better the change was after 4 months. The less frontal areas, posterior single areas were connected, were a little bit loosening of the connection. And that was going on for 4 months in experts. And it's a little, I haven't did on that slide, but the interesting was that the non-experts, they had more fear and they had less attentional capacity and less acceptance, certainly, because they were beginners. The next question I would like to raise a little bit here, and then I'm going to be summarize things, is the question, is consciousness important in these states? And we address this in different ways, and this is one way. We showed people's happy, neutral, and fearful faces, the different emotions. We flashed them for 10, 15 milliseconds, but you don't see it really. It just flashes into your brain, it activates your brain, and sorry, it's jumped again. Can you help me go back one? I don't know which one. Oh, sorry. This is this one. So we flash these people with faces on this side, 10 milliseconds, then you mask the information processing, and they have to rate every trial. Is that fear? Is that happy? Is that nice? So we were not, you don't ask them 2 hours after the trip, just during tripping. They have to focus, certainly. And then what we found is that psilocybin in the unconscious processing reduces fear. Fearful faces, but not happy faces, not neutral. And that's interesting. You don't need to be aware. That supports the idea that psychedelics activate very basic emotional systems we are not aware of. What Loine said, there must be a freeing, an activation of the emotions. And if cognitive control breaks down, then it may come up even more. But how does it come up? Through attentional control, through acceptance, through all different kinds, how you train people to deal with emotions. So these people have not a very tremendous ego dissolution. Of the scale of 100, the meditators had a very strong one, 80%. These people are about 60. These are normal people, like meditation beginners. So that you see, you are not completely dissoluted. Nobody in our whole story of 30 years was completely dissoluted. There were some really deep experienced meditators that said, I was in a space of pure consciousness. But you always have an internal reference point. You couldn't be aware that you have an experience. So it's an illusionary term that you have an ego dissolution. You have a change in ego boundaries. It can be expanded or fragmented. That's very important. People always write about ego dissolution. Oh, I'm nowhere. The void and all this. It's completely nonsense. There's no void available on the psychedelic states. There's a colorful, highly constructed, meaningful world, sometimes a little bit up and down because you have some pathology. That's very simple. But there's no nothing, nothing, nothing. Even the Buddhists we work with say insight is the only thing, the deepest insight beyond structure is realizing themselves there is no structure, there's no permanence, there is dying, there's no immortality. That's what we learned from these guys. So we can then localize regions in the brain that are responsible for emotional regulation, networks, and so on. And if we do it, and that's more important, consciously, people see this, we have an amplification of the modulation of negative information. That's interesting. There's an interaction. We do now a study where we measure sustained attention on a millisecond range, flash people with emotional pictures, and look exactly what capacity, if you have more power to attend what you experience, have you more reduction? Is the driving force the reduction of fearful pictures, faces, or other, we use all other kind of pictures and things, is that driven by attention? Why is that so important? All meditators we train and with retreats, they say the most important training was the concentration meditation, where they focus on objects for weeks, and then go in an open meditation where they try to catch as much as they can. But staying on the negative experience needs concentration, needs attention. So if people float around in a psychedelic space and do not really have the power to follow their things and let it go is energy. It needs power and it's training. So what we did also, in fact, when we started now with patients that jumped at, that we see nice reductions in self-ratings in depressed with one dose, going for 2-3 weeks. But this reduction depends on that people are not confused. If the dose is too high, if they cannot concentrate, if they cannot follow their thoughts and feelings and let it go in terms of a Buddhistic view, don't be attached, if they cannot hold that, the effect is zero. We have people with strong oceanic boundlessness, no effect, no change. We have people with low, very good changes. But the intermediate may be the truth. People don't need a too high dose, but what is based on other data, not of this study, on real data from what we do in Switzerland, that we are in the good position that we can treat people with LSD, as you heard from Gasser yesterday, Peter, or psilocybin. If you treat them repeatedly, you see that often you push them, they open up, after a month they're down, but you push them again, they open up, and suddenly the system becomes stable because they learn to focus inward. They learn to deal with their anxiety. So according, and I will close that now, my understanding, the therapy is not dependent on the oceanic boundlessness per se, on this global construct. There are much more important driving forces. One is emotion regulation. The other is this feeling of connectedness, this unity feeling, the relationship between connected cognitive control and emotion processing, and acceptance. So it depends how you want to train your people. It's way too early to say we know the mechanism, but the only thing I want to say today is attention is very important. Attentional capacity, mindfulness training is one thing. There are many others. Emotion, I'm not an emotion regulation specialist, but I know from friends who are therapists in our department, different approaches to emotional attunement and all these things. And certainly cognitive more training where you teach people if they are in this and this state, let it go. But maybe a combination is the good thing. So I want to thank my group and Hendrik for the nice invitation, and certainly my group of people who I couldn't do this without them. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So that was a long journey from investigating certain processes that appear in consciousness to maybe having some hypotheses about mechanisms of change. So we have 5 minutes to ask questions. Then we have a short break and come back for the award ceremony and the roundtable. So please come up with your questions. So first, Rick Dublin.
Franz, to see if I understood what you said that in the psychedelic experience, there's no complete ego dissolution. I heard you, does that mean in the human experience there's no complete ego dissolution, or is there some other way outside of psychedelics to do it completely, or it's just that humans can't do it?
That goes into very deep philosophy, whether there exists something without any differentiation. If you have a bit of information, it's 0, 1. So you have, if everything is similar, you make a cut, then you have 0 and 1. So that's a differentiation. If you're in a state and you define a state is experientially accessible, if there is no differentiation, I have philosophical problems with that. Every drugs we have tested, people have a lot of content, a lot of structure. What they sometimes say is the 5-methoxy-MO, you know, maybe better than I, DMT. They have a kind of being white stuff, but we have that also with dying people. A person who in St. Gallen in Switzerland, he studies only dying people, and what they report, they have this also. So I think it's a state that might be available to reach with certain anesthetics. We tried a little bit with anesthetics, played around with very low dose, so we can get a little bit in that state, transition state, that is not structured.
Thank you.
But you're still here. You have an ego. You have a perspective. You know it. What you can do, and what we think, what the Buddhists do, is they oscillate. They are in the state. They don't know it. Come out. Oscillate. Gone in and out. That's what Freud did in the analytical work. You oscillate. You hold your attention. You relax because you want to experience. And you reflect your state. That oscillation is what they understood with psychotherapy, because then the therapist feels the patient. If the therapist thinks, it doesn't do a lot of good things for the patient. He has to be empathic, going in the state too. And such oscillation may be approach. We can knock out the brain. With other tools we do, at the moment we do TMS, you know, brain stimulation, and psychedelics. So we can knock out activity of brain areas and study what is the psychedelic doing. If an area is blocked, I don't tell you the story now because we're highly analyzing crazy data. If you block the visual system, take a psychedelic. What are you going to see? Tell me.
Yes, Franz. Please, your question?
Thanks a lot for the very interesting talk. And this modulator of attention.
Where are you?
Here. Hello.
Oh, yes.
Hi.
Sorry.
So I was wondering what the implications of the moderating effect of the attention during the psychedelic experiences. So could this mean that there could be potentially varying doses for personalized doses depending on various levels of preparation of mindfulness training? And
yes, that's a good idea. Yeah, for instance, something like that. But even training the attentional capacity. Also, we thought about neurofeedback. There are a number of commercially available feedback trainings for attentional, for sustained attention. So we have collaboration in San Francisco with a very good lab. They sell it, the system, and you can train 10 minutes per day, 4 weeks, and you see an increase in your attentional capacity. That combining with, I don't know, body scanning or these things would be very nice. So cheap, and it has to be practical, you know. fMRI and all these things is not a good thing for therapy support. It has to be very easy.
So the last two brief ones, one from the online audience. It was about the difference between those levels of ego dissolution you've been talking about and a psychotic break.
A psychotic break?
A psychotic state.
A psychotic state. These states are per definition, according to WHO, are psychotic states because you have visual hallucinations. That's very simple. In a psychedelic state, you have a coherent, there's still a cohesion behind what you experience. Even you see it in all different ways and popping up and thousands of patterns. They are stick together. That's what I say is the ego function. The function, not the content of the ego. The ego sticks these things together. And what we see in schizophrenics, that this cohesion breaks down. And their brain looks different in resting states. There's fragmented. These areas are not just loose in it, less connected through connectivity. If you measure that, they are fragmented partially and quite different from what we see in psychedelic states. It's not the same. But the anxious ego dissolution, that's the last word I do to that. We have seen people on the psychedelics that had quite a high dose and were not in a coherent state. They were where if you wouldn't have known that they have taken too much LSD, you would say, oh wow, is there a very maniac person or is he a maniac schizophrenic? In mania, schizophrenic. It's hard to differ then. Really, it was confusing.
So I'll take the last one for myself, Franz, not to end on psychotic states.
That's nice.
So would you say that training patients with mindfulness techniques before such states is an important and empirically well-assessed technique?
The problem, we do it, we develop it, and but it's too early to say, we have proof, but we see that it helps. I think there are other techniques to making people relaxed and focused. I think there's two things, be more focused and relaxed. Yes, I would support that, yeah, sure.
Thank you very much, Franz Vollenweider.